Sverre, you mentioned that the Thai economy has been very dependent on foreign migrant workers. And this is, of course, a common phenomenon across the region. I sort of observed the phenomenon of securitization of mobility in March 2020, last year, when China tried. I mean, the situation was still very severe, but the Chinese government says, we can't wait anymore to recover, to reopen not as a commerce, but the reopen production. So of course, they knew who is going to do the factory work. Nowadays, it's migrant workers from the countryside. So how do you deal with the dilemma between the need for mobility restriction for the sake of pandemic control on one hand, and then the economic necessity to open the factory again? It is the government, local government, organized so-called point-to-point labor transport. So it's called they call the three-door policies. The door of migrants' home in countryside, the door or the gate of the bus, chartered bus by government organized, and the door of the factory or the dormitory in the city. That the three door means the three door must be connected without any gap between them. So someone pick up my workers from the doorstep of home to the gate of the bus and put them in the bus, and the bus directly go to the factory in the city. Yeah, so that is, they're moving, but as you said, the mobility itself is almost being put in a tunnel.
It's like a bubble.
Yes. Yeah. And but given the situation that, in Thailand, in the border region, many people need to move, and also many people need the workers to move to the factories. Have you heard any similar the measures taking place, either introduced by government or bottom up, initiated by employers or community organizations?
Yes, it's a great sort of example, right? And I think that, for example, one thing that I know that they have been talking about, and I believe they still are discussing this in Thailand, and also with their neighbors like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, is to do something like that in the sense of having, for example, so say with formal labor migration schemes between the governments, that it will include quarantine measures. So say Cambodian workers coming into Thailand, right? That there will be, when they come across, there will be quarantine facilities, etc. And also the transport itself in terms of crossing and so forth, that you will have some kind of bubble wrapped, if you like, sort of mechanism. So it's so it's separated, right, from everything else, and therefore becomes safe, if you like, right? One of the challenges with this, I think, has been that the question becomes, who's going to pay for this? Right, and up until now, at least as far as I'm aware, it seems to be the case that we're not there at this point in time, at least, where say governments are prepared to pay the bill. So, for example, in practice, then what it happens in practice is that a lot of the cost is then added to the migration cost of migrants, and that becomes a problem, because then, they can't. Either they will then try and find alternative ways to migrate, and there are reports, and very difficult to know the numbers, but undocumented migrants appear to have increased, right? So because formal migration pathways are either closed or they are too expensive, and so they haven't been able to set in place the logistical arrangements around them, then you have migrants who go regardless. And let's not forget, this takes us beyond this topic of COVID, but and this is so sad, of course, is the military coup in Myanmar, Because what's happening now, of course, is that you have labor migration, but now you're starting to see people fleeing political violence, right? So here you have populations who really can't sit just and wait patiently for governments to set up some sort of system. So this is one of the problems with it, is that there's discussions around these things, but as far as I'm aware, we don't really have really, certainly not on a large scale, convincing sort of modalities, if you like, around proper care and systems to enable mobility through some sort of securitized form of arrangement. Yeah. Top, sort of bottom down, localized ways of doing this, I'm not able to comment on that in a direct way. I'm not fully aware of sort of good examples of those kinds of measures.
Yeah, but again, I think you alluded to two types of securitization here, right? One is, we can say, it's a direct securitization of mobility by following or tracing the process of mobility itself through either tracing app or transportation arrangement. And the second way of securitization is what you mentioned earlier, like the pink card and the testing and vaccination passport. So that is not about the mobility process, but it is more about the person, the mobile subject.
That's right. Yes.
It seems government's natural choice is the latter, is to control the migrants, the person, rather than to facilitate or condition the process. So the result, as far as we know at this stage, is quite obvious. If you resort to this bureaucratic, document-based securitization through controlling the migrant body, it will open up more kind of space of brokerage, actually obviously increase the cost of migrants and then make the process more complicated. But if we have securitization, which is more about the process of mobility as well as the actual need of migrants, for example, like the earlier policy of Thai government, you open up healthcare system and whoever has a need, you come. We don't really judge who you are, right? Then it's the cost will be low. I'm sure if you have a free government chartered bus, I suppose migrants will join, right?
But yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, compulsory pink card. Then of course they have to pay to forge it, to ask someone else to circumvent that. So there is the securitization. Of course, is a huge range of measures and activities. What is more effective, and in terms of really securitizing, and also what will create more unintended negative consequences that will be really needed to think through.
Exactly. And yeah, and since you mentioned that, Biao, one thing that I find fascinating, and this is not just about say Thailand and the Mekong region, but just broadly, and perhaps even more in the liberal West or whatever, right? This is how COVID triggers certain sore points, I suppose, in terms of ideas around liberal freedoms, right? Because the territorialized logics around migration or mobility governance in the COVID context, the real sort of compromise in terms of liberal freedoms has to do with obviously about movement, right? That you have to be locked down, you can't go outside, and all these kinds of things, right? But the securitization logic, not always, but a lot of it has to do with the important thing becomes who you are, right? That it becomes a form of almost a form of surveillance, in the sense of not necessarily so much about that you have to stand to not move around, but it's more that you have to reveal more about yourself. And that is, the check-in app, where you've been, right? And not just where you've been, but who has been there, right? And the social network analysis connected to all of this too. So it's not just about that, I went to this shop at this particular time, but it's also who else were at the shop at that particular time. Who was I connected with at different time points as I moved through space. So this to me is a very interesting thing about how the securitization and the territorialized sort of governing logics around all of this, they challenge us, I think, in terms of our liberal sensibilities, in terms of what we're prepared to give up. And one has to do with space, where how we move and where we are, but the other one is more about the data mining around it, and it's about the revelation of who we are and as how we are connected to other people. And and it's fascinating how this unfolds in different places. And to take that back to the Mekong region, I think is that I think how this is experienced and thought about differs a lot. It has a lot to do with the local political context and also cultural context. I'm thinking of Laos, for example, which is a one-party state and so forth. I think to compare it back to Australia, where you have a minority, but quite noisy minority, as in many other countries, where they protest against lockdowns and so forth. But in Laos, I don't think, I'm sure there are some people who don't like it, but generally, people are quite cooperative and like it's not thought of as necessarily a big deal. It's more about kind of common sense. You do this because it's a pandemic, and yeah, sure, you just go along with it, and that's it, kind of thing. So this is a fascinating thing too, I think, about how securitization and how territorial border control and so forth, how it plays into political discourses in different contexts.
Yeah. I think what you said, the contact tracing is very interesting. I never thought of that before. It's not about what you have done, but is whom you have been in contact with. This level of social surveillance and intervention, I think it's relatively new. And before, you either just target the individual for your health concerns, or or you look at the total population, right? So there is, focus at the individualization and the totalization as a basis of modern biopolitics. And we always say, as sociologists and anthropologists, the relations between the individual and the collective in the total population. But now, this securitization and tracing do come at this level of roughly the community level, right? Because this is an epidemiological term as well, the community transmission. So that I think that's interesting. So it really complicates our earlier imagination of the national body, the geo body. Certainly, it's not only a geo body, it's not only spatial, and certainly is not free individuals and aggregate into a total people. No, now there is all between that the state is going to look at that level. I think for me, that's probably is quite new. Previously we thought that level really the cornerstone of the civil society should be left completely autonomous, right? And the state should only support. If someone apply for community activity grant, they should support. But apart from that, state should just care for the problem of total population or care for individuals. And so that's I think that probably is more important than so-called infringe of individual privacy. I think this kind of relational privacy may be more important than individual privacy. I don't know. This is just a very, just what I think now really inspired your comment. Yeah.